The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Palais des Nations smelled of recycled air and desperation. Nalini Deshmukh adjusted her burgundy chuba, the traditional Bhutanese garment, feeling suddenly too warm under the harsh fluorescent lights. Around the horseshoe table, delegates from 193 nations waited as the American representative unveiled what he called the framework for 21st century cooperation. Nalini had read the document 3 times already. Each reading made her stomach tighten further. Smaller nations will benefit from consolidated defense agreements, the American droned on, his smile practiced and empty. By pooling sovereignty in matters of security and resource management, we create efficiency. Efficiency. The word tasted like poison. What he meant was control. What he meant was that countries like Bhutan, Tuvalu, Lesotho would become footnotes in decisions made by Beijing, Washington, and Moscow. Across the chamber, Nalini caught the eye of Thomas Eriksson, the Norwegian legal advisor to the Secretary General. His jaw was clenched, fingers drumming silently against his leather portfolio. They had been meeting secretly for 3 weeks now, ostensibly to discuss legal interpretations of the treaty language. But somewhere between the midnight coffee runs and shared frustrations, something else had bloomed, quiet and terrifying. Thomas had told her 2 nights ago, over lukewarm pizza in an empty cafeteria, that he couldn't advise her. Professional ethics bound him to neutrality. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, had said everything his mouth couldn't. Ambassador Deshmukh, the Chinese delegate's voice cut through her thoughts. Bhutan has historically valued peaceful cooperation. Surely your government sees the wisdom in unity. Unity, another beautiful word weaponized. Nalini rose slowly, feeling the weight of her nation's history on her shoulders. Bhutan, the land of the thunder dragon, had survived centuries by choosing its battles carefully, by measuring progress in happiness rather than profit. Her grandfather had been part of the delegation that joined the UN in 1971. He had believed in global community. He had never imagined this. The Kingdom of Bhutan, she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, values unity built on respect, not uniformity enforced through coercion. She paused, meeting eyes around the room. Some delegates looked away. We will not sign a framework that treats sovereignty as a commodity to be traded for security promises. The Russian representative laughed, actually laughed. With respect, Ambassador, your nation's voice, while valued, cannot derail consensus. The major stakeholders have already agreed. Stakeholders. As if nations were corporate investments. As if her people's right to self-determination was a line item in a budget proposal. That evening, Nalini found Thomas waiting outside her hotel. The Geneva streets were damp with early spring rain, and he held a single umbrella between them as they walked along the Rhone. They're going to vote tomorrow, Thomas said quietly. Your foreign minister called mine. The pressure is immense. They're threatening trade sanctions, development fund withdrawals. Nalini stopped walking. The river flowed dark beside them, reflecting city lights like fallen stars. What would you do? Thomas turned to face her, and in the lamplight she could see the conflict written across his features. I can't answer that. You know I can't. I'm not asking the UN legal advisor, she whispered. I'm asking Thomas, the man who told me 3 days ago that he believes in me. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. Then I would say that some principles are worth any price. But I would also say that I am terrified of what that price might be. Nalini reached up, touching his face gently. They both knew what tomorrow would cost. If she walked away from this treaty, she walked away from everything. Her career, her standing in international circles, and this fragile, impossible thing growing between them. Thomas couldn't be seen supporting a delegate who defied the major powers. His position required neutrality. Their relationship, barely begun, would end before it could truly start. I can't compromise on this, she said. I know, he replied, his voice breaking slightly. That's why I'm falling in love with you. They stood there in the rain, under a shared umbrella, knowing that tomorrow one of them would walk away. Knowing that love sometimes meant choosing the harder path alone. The next morning, Nalini sat in her delegation chair for the last time, her speech written and rewritten throughout a sleepless night. When her turn came to address the assembly, she rose with the weight of centuries behind her and the future uncertain before her. The Kingdom of Bhutan withdraws from these proceedings, she began. her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, not in anger, but in preservation of what we hold sacred. The video appeared on social media within minutes. Someone had recorded Nalini's speech on their phone, the footage shaky but her words crystal clear. "We are not bargaining chips in games played by giants," she had said, her voice never wavering. "We are nations with histories older than your empires, with wisdom you have forgotten in your rush toward power." By the time her plane touched down in Paro, the clip had 17 million views. Thomas watched it for the 20th time from his office in Geneva, each viewing more painful than the last. The way she had gathered her papers with quiet dignity, the way she had walked past the American delegation without a glance. The absolute silence that followed her exit, broken only by the heavy door closing behind her. His phone buzzed constantly. Reporters wanted statements. His supervisors wanted explanations about his relationship with the Bhutanese ambassador. Someone had photographed them walking by the river, though thankfully the image was too distant to show their faces clearly. "Thomas, you need to distance yourself," his colleague Henrik warned him over coffee in the UN cafeteria. "The major powers are furious. They're calling it grandstanding political theater." "It was principle," Thomas said quietly. "Principle doesn't pay well in international law," Henrik replied, not unkindly, "and it definitely doesn't advance careers." But something had shifted in the world. 3 days after Nalini's departure, the representative from Fiji stood during a climate session and quoted her speech directly. "We are not bargaining chips," he said, and walked out of negotiations that would have forced Pacific Islands to accept oil drilling in exchange for flood protection funds. Within a week, Vanuatu followed. Then Cape Verde. Then Bhutan's neighbors in the Himalayas began questioning their own positions. The global security framework collapsed in spectacular fashion. Without the smaller nations providing numerical legitimacy, the treaty looked exactly like what it was: 5 powerful countries attempting to formalize their control over everyone else. Nalini watched it all unfold from Thimphu, her small apartment overlooking the valley where prayer flags snapped in mountain winds. She had been quietly reassigned, no longer ambassador but working in the Foreign Ministry's Cultural Affairs Department. A demotion disguised as a lateral move. Her government, while publicly supporting her stance, privately worried about retaliation. But the emails started arriving. Activists from dozens of countries, students writing thesis papers about sovereignty in the modern age, invitations to speak at universities, though her government discouraged her from accepting most. And every night, before sleep, she would open her laptop to a saved folder containing exactly 3 photographs. Thomas laughing over pizza. Thomas serious in conference. Thomas under the umbrella in the rain. She never sent him messages. What could she say? Their moment had passed, sacrificed for something larger than themselves. Thomas kept his own folder, though his contained recordings of her speeches, articles analyzing her impact, opinion pieces debating whether she was a hero or a fool. He dated occasionally, professional women who understood the demands of his work. But every relationship ended the same way, with women telling him he was emotionally unavailable, his heart clearly belonging to someone else. "You're thinking about her again," Henrik said one evening, 5 years after Geneva, as they shared whiskey in Thomas's apartment overlooking Lake Geneva. Thomas didn't deny it. "Did you see she's been nominated for the Right Livelihood Award?" "The alternative Nobel. She's become quite the figure." Henrik swirled his drink thoughtfully. "You know the UN is undergoing reforms. Real ones this time. There's talk of restructuring the Security Council, giving regional blocs more power. Some people say it started with her speech." "It started long before that," Thomas said. "She just had the courage to name what everyone else was afraid to say." The years continued their forward march. Nalini traveled extensively now, her government having realized her international reputation had value. She spoke at conferences about sustainable development, about measuring progress in happiness rather than GDP, about the rights of small nations in a world dominated by large powers. She turned down marriage proposals from suitable men, telling her mother she was married to her work. It was partially true, but late at night she would sometimes search Thomas's name online, reading his published papers on international law reform, watching recordings of his testimony before various UN committees. He had stayed neutral professionally, but his work increasingly focused on protecting the rights of smaller member states. Someone noticed. Someone always noticed. 8 years after Geneva, Thomas was invited to join a special commission reforming the UN Charter. The same week, Nalini was appointed as a special envoy for sustainable development. Their work would eventually intersect, everyone knew, but the timing wasn't right. Not yet. In Copenhagen, Thomas gave a lecture to law students about the evolution of international governance. He spoke about a moment in 2017 when the system nearly broke, when power tried to formalize itself into permanence. But one person stood up, he said, not naming her, though everyone knew, and reminded us that sovereignty isn't granted by the powerful. It's inherent in peoplehood. That speech changed everything, not because it was defiant, but because it was true. A student raised her hand. Do you think she knew the impact she would have? Thomas smiled sadly. I think she knew the cost. The impact was just what happened when principle met the moment. In Thimphu, Nalini received a letter forwarded through official channels. It contained a copy of Thomas's lecture notes with a single sentence, handwritten in the margin. Thank you for teaching me what courage looks like. She held the paper for a long time, tears finally falling after years of careful composure. She wrote back just 4 words on formal stationery. You taught me first. Neither letter mentioned love. Neither needed to. Some things were understood in the space between words, in the choices made and the prices paid. They were connected not by what they had shared, but by what they had sacrificed, and what that sacrifice had meant for the world. The UN announcement came on a Tuesday morning, a major ceremony honoring grassroots democracy movements, scheduled for the following year in Oslo. Both Nalini Deshmukh and Thomas Eriksson were listed among the keynote speakers. 10 years after Geneva, they would finally be in the same room again. The Oslo Opera House rose from the harbor like a glacier, all white angles and glass catching the autumn sun. Nalini stood at the waterfront early, before the ceremony crowds arrived, watching seabirds wheel against a sky the color of Thomas's eyes. She wore traditional Bhutanese silk, crimson and gold, her hair streaked with silver now at 43. The years had carved lines around her mouth and eyes, maps of countries visited, speeches given, principles defended. She wondered if Thomas would recognize her. Inside the opera house, Thomas adjusted his tie for the 3rd time, ignoring Henrik's amused smile. At 45, Thomas had finally grown into his features, the boyish uncertainty replaced by quiet confidence. But his hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his speech notes. It's been a decade, Henrik said gently. You've both moved on, have we? Thomas murmured, and Henrik had no answer. The ceremony began with the pageantry these events demanded. Dignitaries processing, national anthems playing, speeches about democracy and human rights flowing like water, beautiful and forgettable. Nalini sat in the 3rd row, close enough to see Thomas on stage as he delivered opening remarks as chair of the UN Reform Commission. His voice had deepened, she noticed. More authority now, less uncertainty. He spoke about structural changes to international governance, about power-sharing mechanisms, about the voices of small nations finally being heard in rooms where decisions were made. He never mentioned Geneva directly, but she heard it in every carefully chosen word. When his eyes found her in the audience, he faltered mid-sentence, just for a heartbeat. Then he smiled, small and private, and continued. Nalini's speech came after lunch. She spoke about Bhutan's journey, about the decade since that rainy Geneva morning, about the dozens of nations that had found their voice in the aftermath. She talked about the cost of standing alone, about losing opportunities and relationships in service of something larger. We often think of courage as loud, she said, her gaze drifting to where Thomas sat in the front row. But sometimes courage is walking away from what we want most, choosing integrity over comfort, principle over passion. And sometimes the greatest love we can show another person is trusting them to understand why we must walk that path alone. The audience applauded, but she was watching Thomas, whose jaw was tight with emotion. The reception afterward was held in the Opera House's spectacular rooftop area, where guests could walk on the slanted white marble exterior while servers offered champagne and Norwegian delicacies. Nalini avoided the crowds, finding a quiet corner where Oslo spread below her. All harbor lights and distant mountains. You once told me that love meant choosing the harder path, a familiar voice said behind her. She turned slowly. Thomas stood 3 feet away, champagne flute forgotten in his hand. looking at her with a decade of unspoken words in his expression. "I remember," Nalini said softly. "I've spent 10 years wondering if we were right," Thomas admitted, moving closer. "If principle was worth—" He gestured between them. "This. And what did you decide?" "That we were right," he said, "and that it was still the hardest thing I've ever done." They stood in silence for a moment, the Oslo night cool around them. Nalini studied his face, cataloging changes, recognizing the fundamental things that remained. "I read everything you wrote," she confessed. "Every paper, every testimony. I watched you push for reforms that would have been impossible before Geneva." "I have a folder on my laptop," Thomas said, almost embarrassed. 3 photographs from that week. I never deleted them. I have the same folder." Nalini smiled, tears pricking her eyes. 3 photographs of someone I knew for 3 weeks but who changed my entire life." "Nalini," Thomas began, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. I need to say this." She took a breath. "I am not sorry for walking away. I would make the same choice again, even knowing the cost. Because that choice made me who I am. It led to everything that came after, all the good that came from standing firm. But," her voice caught, "I am allowed to grieve what we never had. I'm allowed to miss who you were, who we might have been." Thomas set down his champagne and closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "What if I told you I never married because no one else understood? That every relationship ended because I was comparing them to a woman I knew for 3 weeks in Geneva?" "I would say I did the same thing," Nalini whispered. "And then I would ask what we do now." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "I think," he said slowly, "that we acknowledge we loved each other. That we still do in whatever form that takes. But we also acknowledge that what we have built separately is too important to risk by trying to recapture something from a decade ago." It hurt, hearing it spoken aloud, but Nalini nodded. "We're partners in something bigger than romance. Yes." Thomas lifted one of her hands to his lips, a gentle kiss that felt like both greeting and goodbye. "But that doesn't make it less real. It just makes it different." They stood together watching Oslo's lights, not touching except for clasped hands. 2 people who had chosen principle over passion and were still choosing it. "Will you keep in touch this time?" Nalini asked. "Real correspondence, not silence." "I would like that very much," Thomas said. "Perhaps we can collaborate on some reform projects. Your expertise on small nation sovereignty, my legal background. Very professional," Nalini said with a slight smile. "Entirely appropriate," Thomas agreed, his own smile matching hers. They both knew it wasn't quite professional, wasn't quite appropriate, but it was what they could have, and perhaps that was enough. As the reception wound down, they parted with a long embrace, holding each other like people who had survived the same war, who bore the same invisible scars. "Thank you," Thomas whispered into her hair, "for teaching me that some loves are too important to be reduced to romance." "Thank you," Nalini replied, "for understanding why I had to walk away." 6 months later, Nalini gave a speech at a university in Mumbai where she quoted extensively from Thomas's latest paper on UN Charter reform. That same week, Thomas testified before the European Parliament, citing Nalini's work on sustainable sovereignty as a framework for future governance. They emailed regularly now, long thoughtful messages about policy and principle, occasionally veering into personal territory before retreating to safer ground. They were building something new, something that honored what they had been without trying to recreate it. 3 years after Oslo, the UN announced comprehensive reforms to the Security Council, giving permanent representation to regional blocs of smaller nations. The framework was co-authored by multiple legal scholars and diplomats, but those who looked closely saw Nalini Deshmukh's fingerprints on the sovereignty language and Thomas Eriksson's on the implementation mechanisms. The night the reforms were ratified, Thomas sent a single text message. "We did it," Nalini replied from Thimphu, where dawn was breaking over the mountains. Together, even apart. And perhaps that was the truest love story of all. 2 people who changed the world not by being together, but by being willing to stand alone for what they believed, inspiring each other across distance and time. Their love hadn't ended in Geneva. It had simply evolved into something the world needed more than they needed each other. In her apartment, Nalini kept 3 photographs in a folder and added a 4th, Thomas at Oslo, looking at her with a decade of understanding in his eyes. In his apartment, Thomas kept 3 photographs in a folder and added a 4th. Nalini speaking at the UN, her voice carrying the same conviction that had first made him love her. They were not together. They would never be together, not in the conventional sense, but they were partners in something eternal, the ongoing work of making the world more just, one principled decision at a time. And sometimes, late at night in their separate corners of the world, they would each look at those photographs and feel not sadness but gratitude. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, loved each other in exactly the right way, and let each other go at exactly the right time. Some love stories end with a kiss. Some end with a wedding. Theirs ended with 2 people walking different paths toward the same horizon, forever connected by the courage to choose principle over passion, integrity over intimacy. The world was better for their sacrifice. And in the end, wasn't that the greatest love of all?